Paul. Thanks everyone for being here on this brisk, cold morning. I felt like winter this morning getting up, I have to admit, 4 degrees here in Toronto. As Paul explained, this is sort of an ongoing project. The presentation I'm going to give to you actually started, I work at Aon Benfield. I'm responsible for the cat management team. We're the largest cat team in Canada. We have about 10 people, ultimately doing catastrophe analytics for our client base here in Canada. As a broker, we represent, we place about 60% of the catastrophe exposures in Canada. So we're looking at probably 60%, about $22 billion of catastrophe placement, covering the big one that's going to ultimately affect British Columbia. So just getting back, I've been with Aon Benfield for about a year. This presentation goes back prior to Aon Benfield. I was at Swiss Re for 7 years, and I was the largest cat writers in Canada, and the largest capacity in Canada. So this is a presentation that came out ultimately at the end of I think it's probably 2011. I did this for the Toronto Insurance Conference for a broker community, and what's interesting is it's a bit of a living project, and it's interesting. If you go back to, let's say, the fall of 2011 and what's happened up until now, I started at that time I was really talking more about, Japan principally is what I was talking about in terms of supply chain, but since that, we've certainly had some other losses. We've had the Thailand floods that have taken place, and then Hurricane Sandy. So it's kind of this presentation's evolved. This is the third evolution of this presentation, so I'm trying to thinking of Sandy now and how that affects the supply chain. So just to talk about today, give a brief history about supply chain, talk about Pathcats and how they've affected the supply, and specifically also in the context of contingent business interruption coverage provided by insurance companies on the commercial side. Also talk about ultimately if you've got risk managers in the audience here, or if you're ultimately underwriters for clients. Talk about the what's and where's and how ultimately supply chain, what type of mechanism can be used to ultimately control these exposures. You know what I mean? Because it is a new realm for a lot of people. It is a growing realm, and the expertise is still ongoing. We're not there yet. And then just talk about some other considerations, and then finally end up with some questions. So getting into the brief history of supply chain, up to about 20 years ago, usually several hands were involved in the production supply of materials, parts, products, and this also, manufacturers usually had large stock holdings of these things. This is the way up till 20 years ago. It was usually multi-source, third-party suppliers, the whole concept of wholesalers. I remember as a kid, so many people's parents, what do? I'm in wholesale. Wholesale's gone. We don't have wholesale as much as we used to. We don't have third-party suppliers of providing materials, parts, and stockpiling these things. And also you had a lot of competition. You have a lot of people producing items and competing. But that's really changed. Ultimately, in the last 20 years, you have to have much greater cost efficiency. We've had global competition. What we're seeing is less competing producers. We're seeing less competing producers. They're removing a lot of alternative sources. The whole concept of just in time. Ultimately, from a business management perspective, the thing was have things ready just in time. Do not stockpile. This is starting to bite back. This concept of management, really getting into the Sandy concept, this concept is really now being proven to be not a good idea in some ways. So there has to be some form of stockpiling, some kind of in-between ultimately. Also, you have direct and single sourcing replacing a lot of third-party, these wholesalers, these third-party suppliers, and then the concept of outsourcing. You know what I mean? Where can it be produced more efficiently and cheaply? Ultimately, the global realm comes involved, where you start seeing Asia producing things like that. You also have minimized stock. You have minimized stock throughout the entire supply chain. And also there's just the customer mindset. People expect things now. It's the Starbucks crap. I want a latte now. I do not know what wait 3 months for something. And that's ultimately in the entire supply chain what people expect. But also over the last 20 years, we've seen a change. We've seen a dynamic change in terms of business. We've seen minimized stockpiling. But we've also seen the number of catastrophes over those 20 years also increase, the number of man-made and natural catastrophes. Not only that, if we look at insured losses, we've seen an exponential increase in insured losses over those 20 years. So what, hopefully, getting in terms of this presentation, what I'm hopefully going to try and show to you is that ultimately this change in the whole supply chain dynamic, this global competition, this concept of what's perceived as having greater cost efficiencies, ultimately, this is in direct conflict to what is going on in terms of the cat realm, in terms of cats taking place and the amount and number of cat losses taking place. So that's just a brief history of the supply chain. Now, looking at past catastrophes, let's see how have they affected the supply chain. Well, let's look at the Tohoku earthquake. It took place in 2011. Ultimately, it was a magnitude 9. So people realize this earthquake earthquake ultimately was over what the expected magnitude was supposed to take place in that area. The expected magnitude was supposed to be about an 8.6, so it was never perceived to have an earthquake that big. Based on ultimately this magnitude earthquake exceeding what all expected largest magnitude was, this ultimately results in many things like the reactor meltdown. So you had the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in the Japan region. This is in modern history. It's the fourth largest in the world since 1900. You had multiple tsunami waves along the coast, and they're like, some of them were up to 40 meters in height and were traveling 10 kilometers inland. You had about 20,000 people die and 6,000 people injured. You, of course, had the 3 core meltdowns at the Fukushima nuclear plant. Economic losses, originally they were looking at about $300 billion. That's been revised now to about $210 billion economic loss. Insured losses, they're talking about $40 billion in insured loss. And CBI, or let's say supply chain contingent business interruption. Initially, people were estimating that it was going to be between $5 and $15 billion. Ultimately, what's come out of that is now we're looking at probably the lower end of that, so probably $5 billion. I asked someone if anyone can actually get that information. There's a lot of issues with CBI. It is an area you will get breakdowns of business interruption losses when you have large cats, but there is no real concept of recording things specifically in terms of supply chain or contingent business interruption, that specific claim. So looking at the Japan quake, here's a list that was put out by Aon Benfield shortly after when the quake took place, just sort of summarizing the types of losses that were being incurred. And I'd like to talk about a couple of them today. One of them is Apple, okay? Just giving examples. Try and have an idea, okay, is there a supply chain loss? Is there a contingent business interruption loss there? Well, so we look at Apple. First of all, let's look at Japan in a sense. And what, up until the earthquake, Japan, in terms of worldwide semiconductors, 20% were actually produced in Japan. 60% of silicone wafers are produced in Japan, and 90% of a compound, BT resin, 90% of this resin. This is an essential resin that's used for circuit boards and also making chips. So this is ultimately, let's call it the glue. It's ultimately the glue that puts the wafers and the circuit boards together. 90% of that compound was produced in Japan up until the earthquake. So there was a great dependency in terms of this product itself. This is just the background in general of Japan and how its role in terms of the global supply chain. Now, looking at Apple, initially they came out and they said, okay, this is what happens a lot. You have a loss. You're a publicly traded company. You have to come up with an announcement, say what you've got. So a lot of the time, you come out with the worst case announcement. You know what I mean? You better tell shareholders the worst and then be, relatively surprised when things aren't as bad. So they came out and said, we have a $500 million claim. And they did not break it down between physical damage, BI, or CBI. But the interesting thing was, a lot of analysts were going, well, wait a second. You guys don't do a lot of manufacturing in Japan. You don't hardly do any, actually. There's no first-party manufacturing in Japan. So what was interesting is the iPad 2, if you recall, back in 2011, the iPad 2 came out 3 weeks. The launch date was 3 weeks after the earthquake. So when you look at that, when you actually look at the iPad 2 back during this occurrence, you had 5 essential components that actually were produced in Japan. These are produced by suppliers to Apple themselves. So you had your flash memory that was from Toshiba. Well, they could find an alternative source. So that's not a supply chain issue. Appreciate that people are trying to interpret where is the $500 million coming from. So Toshiba, no, I don't think it's going to work with flash memory. That's not one. The DRAM from a company called Elpida Memory, well, that was also alternatively sourced through a company in the United States. Then it came down to the compass. Of course, I don't have an iPad 2. Maybe one day I'll get one, or an iPad itself. But they've got built-in compass, and that was really the hardest thing to resource. And ultimately, the company that produced it in Japan was called AKM Semiconductor. Now, let's see if there's coverage, and let's talk about AKM Semiconductor. Before I do that, I think it's better just to give the basics of what the difference between a business interruption policy is and a contingent business interruption policy is. So for business interruption, it covers loss of income caused by direct damage to the insured's property by insured peril. So it's at the insured's premises, it's by the insured peril, so you have to have physical damage to have it. CBI is loss of income is caused by direct damage at one of the insured suppliers or customers. We can get into nuances. Is it a first-tier supplier or customer? Is it a second-tier supplier or customer? I'll start getting into that a little later in the presentation. But ultimately, it's off-premises. It's a supplier. Normally, it's named in the policy, and they actually have to withstand loss that's specifically covered under the physical damage policy. So taking this into consideration in terms of AKM, so did AKM, the company that made the compasses, did they incur direct loss? No, they didn't. Actually, they were by compasses because ultimately the mass damage to the infrastructure. You had road, rail, you had ultimately electrical breakdown, across Japan following the earthquake. So they were unable to manufacture these compasses due to that, not because of a physical damage, a peril that's insured under the policy by Apple at that plant. So you also had an evacuation zone. So you had civil authorities coming in and saying, okay, we have a 20-kilometer evacuation zone, and ultimately this affected over 100,000 people who were forced to leave the area. So ultimately, based in terms of the policy of Apple, based on their contingent business interruption coverage, they did not have damage at AKM's property, so they did not have a loss.
Paul, did they have earthquake coverage? Like, did Apple really have earthquake coverage in Japan on their?
No. Like, they didn't have a lot of premises. Like, they might have had sales, they might have an Apple store or something, but they weren't doing first-party manufacturing.
No, but I mean, does it?
So it's overseas. It's a supplier. So AKM is a supplier. So Apple's got a global policy. And most certainly they have properties in Japan, but they're not doing any first-party manufacturing there, right?
But the trigger, was earthquake damage enough to trigger? Is that the PD aspect? Is earthquake?
No. So they had Apple, and they incurred no earthquake damage to their own premises, their first-party premises.
So what about AKM? Did they have?
AKM did not incur any direct damage losses to earthquake.
So they had no earthquake damage.
No. So this is the whole point. The whole concept of CBI is that you need to have direct damage based on one of the perils that's listed in, let's call it Apple's policy. So they did not have any direct damage at all. Ultimately, they were prevented from producing these compasses based on things like the infrastructure, power interruption, the evacuation zone, things like that. Ultimately, according to the way that the policy was written for Apple, there was no coverage provided.
Right.
So it all comes down to the nuances here, but if their factory was in the 20K evacuation zone, but didn't fall down when the earthquake happened, created the tsunami.
Yeah. But Apple's policy, the specific CBI endorsement, and this is what it comes down to, and this is what we're going to hear about Sandy as well. Ultimately, not all CBI policies or extension of coverage are the same. And specifically in terms of Apple's policy, which is the majority of policies, it specifically states that if you have and normally a lot of the time it's a listed supplier or a listed customer, you must have damage of one of the perils in the policy. Yep.
So the bottom line is the risk and insurance manager or enterprise risk manager of Apple needs a more sophisticated knowledge of his risks in order to do a proper risk assessment to purchase the insurance.
Yeah, he needs to understand the supply chain completely, has to know ultimately what the impacts are, knows what the physical and the financial consequences are in terms of every aspect of the process.
And quite often the risk manager is somewhat of a different mindset than an insurance person. Sometimes they float over from insurance, but don't have the same insurance mindset. And perhaps, I guess in this case, needs a slightly different mindset.
Perhaps, pardon me, what?
In this case, needs a different mindset and to fully understand his supply chain before he starts going in and figuring about what sort of policy coverage he needs.
Exactly. And, you have to think of what their policy coverage is, what ultimately needs to be listed, what they have to go through. Ultimately, you have to have a business continuity plan. You have to see, okay, what ultimately can be replaced and what can't be replaced. And this, I'm going to get into it because you weren't here for the beginning of the presentation, but what I'm saying is this is really an evolving topic. You know what I mean? Like, I've been doing this is an evolving presentation. This is the sort of third iteration of it. And, like, things have changed so much since I started talking about this in 2011. And it's like insurers are becoming a hell of a lot more savvy about this. But the whole world is becoming much more plugged into this. So, but this is just one example. Yep.
I'm reflecting back on the ice storm in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome topic, so please. So the ice storm did damage to the power infrastructure. It took down some of those towers, and we had parts of Quebec where there was no power for a period. But in Montreal, it's my understanding that the officials closed off a big part of the downtown. You can't come to work now. But they didn't necessarily have physical damage from an accumulation of ice. We had a public authority saying,
civil authority.
This is closed. Those businesses were not taking in any money. I mean, would they have qualified for a business interruption claim?
As far as I know, no. The only thing I heard in terms of civil authority or let's say off-premises power was increased cost of living, which ultimately we have a class action suit I don't think it's even finalized in Quebec. I think it's still ongoing. That's all that I'd heard in terms of that realm where you didn't ultimately have physical damage to take place. You did not see that. Yep.
Well, the civil authority clause often is an extension on your business interruption coverage, so there could be some there, but it's usually a stipulated amount or.
And CBI doesn't always include that, you know what I mean? Like ultimately, while I don't want to say it's been a gift by insurers, CBI, but there has been at least some.
But in answer to Paul's question, like with the direct business interruption for the clients in downtown Montreal that did not get it, they would have some sort of coverage normally.
But in terms of the mass quantum of the loss, I'm a treaty guy, so to me it was principally spoiler. It was a freezer spoiler, increased cost of living. That's all that. It was a $1.4 billion loss, and it was about $800 or $900 million of freezer spoilage. So that's sort of how I sort of see it, but I didn't see a lot of BI in terms of civil authority. So there's an example. So Apple comes out, they say $500 million, and ultimately there's no CBI loss at all. Second one, what I'm trying to hone in on here is electronics in automobiles, because that's really what we're seeing consistently here is electronics in automobiles, electronics, computers, things like that. There's sort of a common thing when I'm talking about some other events that have taken place. So the second loss looking at would be General Motors. They came out and said ultimately that they had $1 billion, and they didn't just say, Apple didn't sort of specify what it was. General Motors came out and said $1 billion CBI coverage. That's what it is, or loss, excuse me. So let's talk about how Japan, where it sort of fits in sort of the grand scheme of things for automobile parts. So in terms of electronics for automobiles, up until the earthquake, Japan specifically, the country of Japan produced about 230 essential parts, let's say the average 3,000 parts that go into a car. So these parts were exclusively made in Japan up until the earthquake. They were sourced from Japan, from manufacturers in Japan. The auto shutdowns, and this is based on the entire Japanese auto industry in a sense. The auto shutdowns following the earthquake, they worked out to, we're talking Toyota, Honda, and Nissan principally, but also globally, because this is also part. There is a knock-on effect in terms of these 230 essential parts. It worked out to be $230 million a day. That's what it turned out in terms of close down, in terms of what it worked out to. But you had some very specific things that were certainly big in terms of bottleneck supplied parts. You had a company, Renesas Electronics. They had a 40% worldwide share of the microcontroller market. Microcontrollers used for engines, ultimately cars are much more electronically based. So they had 8 plants in the affected area, and many that shut down for up to 4 months. So that was a big loss of a supplier for all the car manufacturers. And this isn't just for Japanese cars. This could be BMWs. Ultimately, it's parts being shared by North American cars. Hitachi, for example, they produced, up until the earthquake, they produced 60% of the global car engine airflow and sensors. So they closed their factory because of it too. So this ultimately had a knock-on effect. So I'm giving you a background to say, okay, well, why did GM, again, earthquake takes place, what does GM do? They do a press conference or whatever they do, and they say, it's $1 billion. So looking at GM, so they said it was $1 billion CBI claim, and this ultimately affected, in that press release, they said it affected shutdowns in Louisiana, Texas, Spain, and Germany. And then interestingly, after, so they'd given a period that there'd be ultimately a 12-month period of interruption or 12 months of interruption in these plants, but ultimately 3 months after the earthquake, GM came out and said, actually, the Japanese auto suppliers had fared much better than they expected, and actually Japan, they wouldn't have a material impact on the 2011 results. So they went from $1 billion to say, actually, you know what? The suppliers in Japan did such a good job getting their stuff back together that we're not going to actually have a result. As a result of that, the magnitude of the loss isn't there. It's never been published what it was, but it's probably going to be a hell of a lot, quite a bit less than $1 billion. Most likely in the double-digit range, if that's what it's going to be for CBI loss. So 2 examples from Japan, came out with large losses. Ultimately, they weren't nearly as big as what was thought in terms of supply chain interruption. Well, why is that? Well, ultimately, the Tohoku earthquake, it was expected to affect Japan for about a 12-month period. But it didn't do that. Ultimately, you had 80% of Japanese manufacturers, they're back to manufacturing and production to pre-earthquake levels by July 1st. The earthquake only took place in March. This is incredible. Ultimately, you had a massive recovery taking place. You had the share prices. So the pre-earthquake share prices, in terms of, this is the major traded shares, the top 100 shares in terms of the Nikkei index. You had the shares recovering to their levels, the pre-earthquake levels by July 15th. This is unbelievable how this could happen. You know, you had domestic production for Toyota, Nissan, and Honda get back July. And, you know, why was this? Well, the biggest reason, what a lot of people they say is it's because of the cultural traits of Japan. Ultimately, you have a country that recovered from the Second World War. This is a country that knows how to recover. It's a very well-organized country. What's interesting is you ultimately had great ideas. You had the power grid go down because Japan was so nuclear dependent up until the earthquake. Then you had the three core meltdown. You also had ultimately a lot of nuclear plants going offline. Well, ultimately what you did is have a lot of brownouts. You had demands like switching across the country. Well, what does the whole country do in terms of manufacturing? Normally they work Monday to Friday. This is our work week. You work Monday morning to Friday night, just like us. What did they do to fix that? They changed the work week. They said, the heck with that. We're gonna alternate work weeks in different parts of Japan. We're gonna make the work week Saturday to Wednesday. Because ultimately there's not as much demand for electricity on weekends. So you got a whole nation involved to say, this part of Japan that's affected, this part that's most affected in terms of loss of power, we're going to change the work week. So these are some of the reasons why. It was an exceptional recovery in terms of what took place. So there's certainly cultural and organizational traits being attributed to that. So Thailand floods. So we saw that these take place shortly after, not that long after Japan. And this is, again, when this took place, you had a lot of doomsayers saying this is going to be a massive supply chain contingent business interruption loss. Just giving you some facts, ultimately you had two hydrological phenomena taking place. You had monsoon rains going from July to September. So this took place, this was a October 2011 event. You had monsoon rains from July to September prior that had 40% increase in the amount of rain coming down. So you had excess rain. And also you had a high tide. You had a spring high tide season taking place in October that ultimately, so you had the ocean at a high tide. You had much more rain coming down, and where do they meet? They meet in Bangkok, but they meet above Bangkok. Ultimately, you had water coming from both ends pushing up, so you're increasing ultimately water levels. So it was a rare phenomenon. When we talk about rare phenomena, we can talk about Sandy in a second, because that was also a very rare phenomenon that seems to be causing these types of losses. So you had 500 deaths. You had 4 million homes, businesses, facilities destroyed. You had 1,000 industrial facilities destroyed. And that also, of those, you had 430 multinationals that were actually affected by that with 2 meters of water for up to 2 months. Economic loss, about $50 billion. Total insured losses of $15 billion. What they're estimating right now in terms of that loss is, of that $15 billion figure, the estimate still stands about 85% of that is BI specifically, not physical damage. But in terms of what the breakdown of that amount is, still unclear. So about 12 to $13 billion of that $15 billion loss was business interruption caused. It's hard to find out exactly what it is in terms of supply chain or continued business interruption. Now, when you think of Thailand, up until this loss, when you think of Thailand, you think of beaches, you think of people going on vacation, they're backpackers. Ultimately, Thailand has done a very good job in terms of its branding, tourism branding. Ultimately, it's a real destination to go to, an ideal. But what really came up in terms of when these floods took place, what really seemed to come to mind is how much Thailand is involved in terms of the automobile and computer electronics industry. That's really what came out to be. And these are some of the companies that were affected. Of the 430 multinationals, these were the greatest affected companies in terms of that. What I'd like to talk about is a couple examples of companies affected to see how is the supply chain affected. So Western Digital. So, just to give you a background in terms of hard drive manufacturing. So up until the floods, 43% of all hard drives manufactured in the world were made in Thailand. And those were principally made in the flood zone. This is an massive 1,000 industrial complexes all north of Bangkok in a flood zone. Yeah. You also had hard drive manufacturers there. So you had about, component providers. So you had about 60 manufacturers also in those areas located there. And the Western Digital incurred a massive loss. And that single facility, so the single facility that was flooded, it produced 25% of the global supply of sliders. So ultimately, they were providing components, not just for themselves. Sliders are essential parts in hard drives. They were providing sliders for their competitors. And they had 25% market share of the plant that was flooded by 2 meter water levels of water. So what are the loss scenarios? And let's look at customers, for example. So these are the customers ultimately that were affected by the loss of hard drives. These are the customers that increased their prices once the flood took place because hard drives were harder to source. Looking at one specifically, Hewlett-Packard. So, you know, within a month of the Western Digital plant was flooded, you had the president of Hewlett Packard coming up and saying, even after a month, they had no idea. They had no idea how they're going to cope with it. They didn't have an idea of the complete picture or when they're going to be back up and running. So this is 1 month after the loss. Well, the results for 2011 for Hewlett Packard, ultimately, when they did tally the results, the flooding of the Western Digital plant in terms of the effect of their product, it ultimately resulted in a $2.3 billion drop in their annual revenue. So Hewlett Packard was far too dependent on Western Digital. They did not have a very good business continuity plan to find alternative sources. But that's not just going to be Western Digital. Part of it could be the sliders. You know what I mean? The sliders, ultimately, it's a catch-22. Ultimately, you know what I mean? It's not just the hard drives. Maybe Seagate couldn't produce something either. That's customers. So that's an example of customers being affected. What about suppliers? Well, you know, semiconductor manufacturers. Ultimately, they produce a lot of semiconductors in that area. You have companies such as LSI, Marvell, Samtec, Sanmina, SCI Corporation. Their fiscal year, they looked at their quarter, they lost, the fiscal quarter, their net income dropped 70% in the last quarter of 2011. All because of the Western Digital plant. Specifically because of the Western Digital plant, they were dependent on some of the products being provided there. Marvell Technology, they lowered their outlook too, citing the Thailand flooding. So customers and suppliers were affected by this. But what's more interesting is the intangible effect in terms of market share. When you look at Western Digital. So pre-flood, this is the world scope and who was leader of hard drive manufacturers. Western Digital was the largest manufacturer, Seagate, Hitachi, Toshiba, Samsung. After the flood, Seagate did manufacture in Thailand, but they weren't in the flood zone. They had made their plants on high ground. Seagate came out as number one, Western Digital number two. Western Digital lost their market share because of the flood. Ultimately, this is an intangible cost, is what's happened because of the flood that took place. What also happened because of the flooding is this ultimately increases consolidation activity. As a result of the flood, the different players in the hard drive market were forced to consider consolidation. So what happened was Seagate, they ultimately merged with Samsung. They are now still the largest manufacturer of hard drives in the world because of the flood. Western Digital, they actually merged. There was a Hitachi sort of split up their divisions. They had the 2.5-inch drives, which we have in laptops, and the 3.5-inch, which is more home PCs. Ultimately, Hitachi split what they did to Western Digital and Toshiba. So,
sorry, do you think that Seagate built outside of the floodplain on purpose, or was it?
I've tried to look up information on it. You know, it'd be a great sort of PR thing to say that. I haven't been able to, I've seen people admire them for it, you know what I mean, but I haven't heard them personally say, this is why we did it, you know what I mean? Like, it'd be great, yeah. If you're the risk manager, that's the best thing to say at all, I guess. But. So that's hard drives. Looking at the companies again, so I talked about electronics, computers, and cars. Our companies. Honda had a plant that was completely inundated during the floods. To give you a breakdown of exactly what happened, it was 45 days under sometimes 10 feet of water. And it was not just flooding, it was a bombardment. Ultimately, you had water going through. What was explained by the Honda executives. They had Honda executives come by boat. They were going through the plant on rafts through the plant. And they actually likened it. They said it was flooding, but they likened it to a tsunami. Ultimately, you had fast-flowing water that was actually ripping up internally installed equipment. So it wasn't just wet, it was also water bombardment that took place. So what's interesting is Honda, in terms of the area that was affected, they had one-tenth of their Tier 1 suppliers were also flooded in the area. So they manufactured. Why did they go to Thailand in the first place? Well, certainly cheap labor, good infrastructure, because they've got their first tier suppliers right there, and one-tenth of them were actually flooded. So 1,000 assembled cars were destroyed. You had 6,300 people that were laid off up to 5 months. 5 months is pretty good. When this flood took place, Honda came out and said conservatively, it's going to be a year. It's going to be a year before we're back up to capacity. They are up within 5 months. Again, perhaps a Japanese company, good resources. Ultimately, a big contributor to why they actually got things online much faster. Let's say they beat it by 7 months. Is they were building plants in Indonesia. Ultimately, they had alternative sources. This is very specialized equipment, but luckily, Indonesia isn't that far. They were in the process of making a plant with all the robotics and whatnot. They were able to take assembled products already in the production that are already producing, take those and move them to Thailand to rebuild. So you also have the stoppage of certain models. So you had 30% of the global output was affected. So the Civic, the Jazz, the CR-V, and the City model, all mass-produced, mass-produced cars. Small margins on these cars, but ultimately that is lion's share being 30% of what their product is. So in terms of the supply chain loss, what type of loss are we talking about? So the disruptions in the fourth quarter affecting, because of course there's always interdependency between car plants and what's manufactured. So India, Indonesia, Japan, Canada, US, and Europe was affected because of this. You had 2011, 2012, their financial year goes actually from April 1st to March 31st every year. So you had it's actually 260,000 units were actually not manufactured. You had disruption of launches of products. So for example, the Brio, that was a brand new car coming out shortly after that. That was principally for the Indian market. They had to do change in terms of release of that. The CR-V, I don't remember, the CR-V was supposed to come out in the end of 2011. It was delayed till 2012 because of that. What kind of affected this how? What kind of losses? Well, for their fiscal years, which again, I said it ends March 31st, their fiscal year, I guess it's their fiscal year 2011. It ends in March 2012. So their overall sales globally were down 11%, production was down 24%, and their net profit was down by $3.2 billion. $3.2 billion their net profit went down because of this. Up until now, I've heard of no claims, contingent visitor claims. What I've done, who knows? You know what I mean? Ultimately, things like this, this is not a company, and perhaps this is maybe, I don't know if this is the Japanese way or not, I'm not sure, but they didn't do a GM approach where they sort of came out and said, this is the quantum. No, this is one where ultimately I've heard nothing in terms of CBI. Through the resources I've seen through Aon Benfield, I've heard of no CBI loss so far. So, people say, why'd they rebuild it? You know what I mean? Like, why did Honda go in there in the first place? Well, it's a bit of a calculated risk return. You know what I mean? People say, I wouldn't say people would liken their Thai floods to a black swan scenario that had never thought about before, but appreciate this, that ultimately in that region, while 2011 was the largest flood of all time in that area, you had 8 large flooding events in that area since 1942. Okay? Appreciate that in 1942, like pretty much a little bit after that. So post-World War II, up until the end of World War II, this was rice paddies. That's all it was. And what's good with rice? Well, water. You know what I mean? That's the whole point. This was agricultural land that was flat, that had good access to ports as well as to cities and also to labor, not far from Bangkok. So ultimately, this was industrialized in a very simplistic way. So what's the sort of calculated risk return? Well, maybe Honda incurs a $3.2 billion loss. I don't know. I think they started manufacturing in Thailand. I think they started building their plants in 1970. So let's say it's a 40-year. Let's say it's every 40 years they pay an additional $3.2 billion. They pay an additional $3.2 billion every 40 years, right? But their profit over that period is probably going to be a heck of a lot more than $3.2 billion. I appreciate it's increasing every year. But because of that, what are they getting? Well, they're getting a skilled workforce that's still relatively cheap. They're getting an excellent proximity to Southeast Asian market, also for co-manufacturing, not far from Indonesia, not really that far from India, not far from the market of Australia to sell the cars. Places like that, China, my God, what a great place to be in terms of China. You've got a very enlightened regulatory approach. Thailand is probably the most open market when it comes to foreign investment and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And also, it's a very stable, it's a stable company that ultimately has some pretty good infrastructure. So at the end of the day, maybe it was a calculated risk return. That's why Honda decided to retool that plant. Now, they did retool that plant and appreciate that loss, and when they went back up online, when they ultimately went back online in April 2012, a 70-mile trench was built around the industrial complex where Honda and other manufacturers were. So they were able to build a 70-mile trench to ultimately avert something like this happening again. Yep.
Is it true that a lot of manufacturing capacity was moved from Japan after the quake to Thailand before the flood?
That's very good. I'm glad you mentioned that. That was a huge. The timing was pretty close, but you're right. Ultimately, after the March 2011 earthquake, there was a lot of manufacturing that was moved over offshore to Thailand, and then Thailand took place.
Do you know if they've done anything else in terms of risk management, say set up an internal fund that they'd be funding for the next flood or anything?
There is a tax. There's a 35, not very much. It's like, what is that? I remember, I just read this
I
actually.
was thinking Honda itself setting up some
So
sort of.
this is actually, this is Thailand itself, they're charging, there's a tax being levied, it's like 35 cents on every $1,000 of income or something like that, I don't know, to eventually fund something. Honda themselves haven't heard anything, I've just heard about state systems.
Because they could do some internal funding to ensure they had money to handle that sort of thing.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything.
Essentially an internal reinsurance program or an internal insurance program.
I might be wrong, but I think Thailand secured a contract with INMAP to map the country.
Okay.
To what?
Map the country. Pretty sure Intermap's entered into an agreement with.
Oh, okay. They're, interestingly enough, affiliate of Aon Benfield, they came up with the, impact forecast. They came up with the first Thailand flood model that came out last year. So I don't know if there's any involvement in terms of that, but, nothing was, there was maps, but it was still fairly rudimentary in terms of now they're trying to do ultimately stochastic, probabilistic approaches perhaps to flood. So, in terms of outstanding coverage issues for Thailand, and again, it's not definitive what the CBI loss is, but there was reinstatement issues in the policies. You had issues where you had first loss limits on multiple locations for industrial policies. Event limits were not always specified in all policies, which is an issue. The dates of damage vary at the industrial estates. It was a 4-month event, so it's a gradual event versus perhaps a sudden accidental event. You know what I mean? It's not like it suddenly happened. So there's the concept there's going to be multiple events. And what I've heard a lot of is that there was a lot of second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth-tier suppliers that were nowhere near listed on a lot of the policies, and this is always a condition. What a lot of insurers are trying to do, although it has been a fairly liberalized market, is that to ultimately list the suppliers, and that wasn't always the case. So people were sourcing sourcing parts and whatnot from suppliers that weren't listed in policies, so therefore it's not actually covered in the CBI endorsement. Sandy. So, Sandy, it's the largest recorded Atlantic storm in terms of its diameter. It was 3,200 kilometers large. It went from South Carolina to Maine and went all the way to the Great Lakes. It affected 21 states in the United States. It's a very rare combination, like I was saying about the Thailand floods. Ultimately, you had a Category 1 hurricane. Of course, when it made landfall, it was not a hurricane, that's for sure. It was a Category 1 hurricane that merged. There was a cold front. There was a cold front taking place. You also had the jet stream coming from the west. And what normally happens is when a hurricane goes up the the Atlantic seaboard, it goes in a direction along the seaboard, but ultimately goes in a northeasterly direction. What happened here was because of the cold front, because of the jet stream, it went right inland. And that was the odd aspect about this. You also had the inopportune concept of having a full moon, which you had enhanced gravitational pull, which ultimately increased your tides. So this is all what created this sort of perfect storm, or what people like to call a Frankenstorm, is what it was. 285 people dead, $8.5 million affected by loss of power, economic loss of approximately $65 billion, 1.38 million claims, majority of them about 900,000 are personal lines. 1.1 billion are personal lines. And what's interesting is it's now considered the largest commercial loss in U.S. history. We always think of these losses, we never really differentiate. You think of Katrina, you think of Andrew, you think of whatever. But ultimately, this one is considered the largest one in terms of commercial lines, because most of those were personal lines losses that took place. They're saying that the supply chain interruptions are estimated about 15%. Again, it's not very a lot of definitive information on that. But what's interesting about it, when you think of supply chain and what it could be, it's a densely populated area that was affected. It's non-manufacturing. Outsourcing did not take place there. And ultimately, it was really affected its supply network in terms of energy, road, port, and communication and communication failures. So what kind of, is there any, based on the information we have so far, is there any substantial supply chain losses? Well, if you look at the results, if you look at the 2012 underwriting results, they were better than 2011. 2011 had some excessive tornadoes taking place. Still, they were better. And ultimately, the contribution of Sandy is being attributed to be about 3.5% of the combined ratio of 107. So it's actually not a big influence when people think of it that way. How about companies that were affected? Well, let's look at suppliers of, let's say, to cell phone companies. Well, they were affected. For the fourth quarter, their earnings per share were reduced by 7 cents, or 16% reduction. They've attributed that specifically to Sandy. Is it drastic? Not really. That's just the quarterly result. Figure what that is, figure what it is on an annualized basis, it's not a lot. It wouldn't be 4% because ultimately there's perhaps more telephone usage in the last quarter of the year with holidays taking place, but it's not a very big influence ultimately in terms of earnings per share. Staples, interestingly, for their fourth quarter, their sales declined by 5%. And they directly attributed two things in terms of Sandy. They said they had lower customer traffic. Well, you got 21 states affected by, by the biggest storm of all time. I can see that, less walk-in traffic. But this is an interesting one here, which is the more competitive Black Friday. Ultimately, Staples, in terms of their operations, were too well located within the storm area. And because of that, Black Friday took place 3 weeks after the storm took place. Black Friday, of course, we don't have it really here in Canada. Cyber Monday would probably be their big one, which is more the electronic stuff that's sold on Monday after Black Friday. But disarray took place. Ultimately, Staples they encountered greater competition in Black Friday this year because of the market disarray that took place. Ultimately, if you're it's mainly online stuff, but if you're an online distributor that does not have any facilities or, let's say, logistics that are based on the affected area, and that could put you in a greater competitive position than a company like Staples, which ultimately has far too much logistics based in the northeast part of the United States. So two things specifically attributed to Sandy in terms of the results. Again, the result, 5%. Not that much. That's just for that quarter. It is their biggest quarter, of course, because holiday time takes place then, but not as big as some people might think. UPS, another type of provider. This was the big thing, too, in terms of ultimately, transportation was a big issue in terms of Sandy. In terms of what happened to them, they saw their operating profit for the year of 2012. The operating profit went down by 5.6%, or about $75 million. They attribute that specifically to Sandy. It's again not a huge substantial amount, but it's still something there. This one I think is the most interesting is Delta Airlines. Again, the types of companies that were affected by things like Sandy. Well, you know what? They said they had if you look at both their 2011 and their 2012 financial years, they said specifically from the storm itself, they had to cancel 20,000 flights. Now, if you look at that number 122, I don't really know the airline industry very well, but I think, oh, okay, I guess maybe that's because they had to cancel the flights. But that's not why. That's not why they lost. That's not really what made them lose $122 million. What's interesting in terms of, it's kind of like a hedging of supply chain. What happened is in the early 2012, Delta thought that they would hedge the cost of kerosene. Kerosene is what fly planes. They said, we're going to hedge our bets in terms of the cost of what fuel is and how much it's going up. So they bought out a regular gasoline diesel refinery from Amoco Oil Corporation in early 2012. But you can't use diesel and gasoline for their planes. But what they thought was, okay, we'll get into the petro industry, we'll buy this plant, we'll refine gasoline, and then we can hedge it against the cost of kerosene. In Amoco, they had already had agreements with the companies that produce kerosene. They would produce gasoline and diesel, and then when the cost of those went up, they would go up in the same level in terms of kerosene. But what happened was, unfortunately, is that plant sustained an $85 million loss because of water damage. Yep.
So they got involved in the business was not their core competency.
Yep.
They didn't understand, and then basically applied that to certain offsetting principles that they also probably didn't understand.
Yep.
They got schmucked by a natural hazard.
Exactly.
Ouch. Okay.
So, in part, you're sharing with us that you've worked really, really hard to get the numbers, but they're difficult numbers.
Now I understand why I'm not a senior.
Yeah, so an interpretation of what you're sharing here, Verizon and Staples and UPS.
I didn't say that.
So the quarter was together. Here's how our earnings turned out. If they had made a claim, that would have been taken into account when they reported their earnings, right? So this is net of whatever they were able to or expected to recover in their.
It's hard to say.
Claim.
You know what I mean? I don't even know. The claims process appreciates that you would suspect, appreciate the timing of the storm as well, right? Like, it depends if their financial year ends December 31st or not. BI claims take a long time to settle.
Right.
So ultimately, if there is going to be any recoveries, let's say if they got a specific CBI coverage or something, it's going to be in latter years.
I would suggest, again, for those who are actually accountants, I'm not, under U.S. GAAP and reporting requirements, if they have a reasonable expectation of making insurance recovery, I mean, they'd be taking a best shot at what they think that number is.
Yeah.
Not, again, you were sharing earlier, spin on this could be, I think it could be this bad at Apple, but it turns out to not be so bad because I'm a good manager, or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, I would think some of this, and some of that perhaps needs to be exposed. The one where I thought I was tracking a little bit, Suncor had their big claim.
You mean the conveyor belt one?
Well, I mean, wouldn't part of your disclosure of this is how much revenue I brought and whatever, at some point, if you had a very large insurance claim that was not yet closed, that might be reported somewhere in their statements?
Appreciate it. Suncor, Western Digital, GM, Apple, they're manufacturers, right? These are more service providers, and that's ultimately what I'm trying to show you here is that this was something that affected transportation, mobile. So it's not the tangible loss isn't as black and white, I think, as though. So perhaps that muddies the waters a lot. In terms of having a reasonable expectation of having a CBI coverage, yeah, I would hope that it's in there, but I don't know. And it's very hard to get information. You know what I mean? Ultimately, publicly traded companies, they're be very careful what you release, what your communications are, because your share price is just as competitive as the sales you're doing out of your stores, right? So your market capital is just as important. So this one for Delta, yeah, this one's this is quite interesting. Anyways, it's not really a supply chain. Well, it's kind of like a supply chain. It's sort of effective with the supply chain. I just thought this was I hadn't even heard about this, but I just thought this just shows you how when things can go bad. You know what I mean? You think you're being smart, but maybe you're not.
So they're $85 million loss to the
Just traded up.
and the total loss 122. So the difference
Is maybe the 20,000 flight.
Right.
You know.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. So the big thing about Sandy is, and like I explained to you, it's not a big manufacturing, it's not a big outsourcing area. Appreciate when Sandy took place, like the different dynamic I see on this one is when you had Tohoku, you had Thailand, you've had other losses previously. It's the insurance press that perhaps speculates there's going to be a large CBI loss. What's interesting about Sandy is that you had a lot of lawyers involved. Now, I'm not saying ambulance chasers, but you had lawyers, you had companies that were putting out papers. They were almost trying to get, class action. I don't know if it's class action suits, but a lot of legal opinion came out saying this is going to be huge for supply chain. This is going to be a massive CBI loss. And we're not, again, it's just like those other two. We're not really seeing it in some ways. And some of the problems really has to come down to, okay, there's a lot of perils we're talking about here too. Like, what perils actually caused the damage? Was it wind? Was it rain? Was it storm surge? Was it flood? Was it off-premise power? Was it like civil authority? Was it looting? Was it vandalism? Like, this is the hard part of trying to determine what goes where and what's covered. And then there's waiting periods. What type of deductibles apply, because you can have different deductibles depending on the peril. The limits, you know what I mean? In terms of limits, in terms of the ISO form, if you're looking at the ISO CBI form, you'll have full limit for things like civil authority, but you'll have sub-limit for things like off-premises power. You know what I mean? So it all kind of depends. You also, in terms of what you're also seeing is ISO, so their CBI form, ultimately in the beginning, because of Thailand, because of Japan, in 2012, early 2012, ISO, everyone knows that ISO is out there, so the policy form company in the United States, they came out with a revised contingent business interruption policy, and they ultimately started including, previously it only listed first tier, so first-tier suppliers, first-tier manufacturers. In early 2012, they revised their form to also include the concept of second tier, so suppliers, customers of your first-tier suppliers and customers. The thing with ISO forms is they have to be approved by each state that they're accepted in. So they brought the process out in the beginning of 2012. They still don't have all the states signed off on it. So it's not really, you have to have all the states sign off on it before it becomes like if you're using a locally licensed writer just specifically in a state and that state approves it up until the loss, that's fine, they can use that form. So you have a more generous CBI form that's out there, but ultimately those forms hadn't made it to the market. So that's, again, you'd have limitation of it just being to first-tier customers and suppliers. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the way the American market works. Do you have to use the ISO forms once they're approved, or do you still have the ability to use your own?
You still have the option to use your own, certainly. You know, if you have customized policies.
There's about 2 or 3 suppliers, ISO is one, AS something or other is another one.
There's customized coverages
And then you
too.
can have your own, and
Yeah.
you got 50 different jurisdictions, 50 different rules, and it's...
So the local risk manager really has to be on the ball when comparing companies.
Exactly.
So, so you have the ISO, the contingent business interruption form, the new and the old. You also have the concept of flood. You know what I mean? Like, we always say in Canada, well, flood's not covered for habitational lines, but it's covered for commercial lines. Well, in America, it's not like that because you have a national flood insurance program. So appreciate that not all commercial policies, actually the majority, so we're talking smaller commercial insurance, the majority don't have flood coverage by private insurers, non-NF people. You also have the concept to describe premises, and that really gets in the first tier. Are they listed in the policy? Is the first tier listed or not? And then the whole concept, which I've talked about in terms of the Apple example, is the whole direct physical. Did direct physical damage take place at the premises? And that was not always the case. So therefore, so a lot of policies don't have that. Looking at some other recent catastrophes: Australia, New Zealand, Chile. Not a lot of supply chain. You know, Australia, this is the floods that took place about 2.5 to 3 years ago. Those were principally a lot of that's raw materials. Those are all resourced, not problems in terms of that. New Zealand quakes, we talked about perhaps some losses taking place. Again, not a very big manufacturing outsourcing area. We're not going to see a lot of supply chain there. But there is the concept of the central business zone that was closed for an extended period. Chile, the earthquake that took place. That's another one where, again, if you get into areas where it's less sophisticated, you can usually resource your material. The biggest effect, I think, in Chile was the wine. So 36% of all pre-2010 wine was destroyed with that earthquake.
Mm-hmm. My understanding in Sandy is that there was a large discussion about was it technically a hurricane or not a hurricane, and policies had worded or coverage being different if it was a hurricane or not.
Deductibles.
And then we were just having a discussion about different forms where the regulator stepped in and said that's a very interesting scientific, it just doesn't matter. And by decree said, here's how everybody will cover them.
Yeah.
Does the superintendent have the power to affect, for example, a reinsurance contract? If the superintendent says, we will decide that it was or was not a hurricane for the primary contract, but for the second, for the reinsurance or whatever, I mean, it's what's legally there, right?
No, that's the first rule of reinsurance is that you have no cut-through clause. There's no way. That's the first rule of reinsurance is. You know what I mean? Like it's a specific agreement between the reinsured and the reinsurer, not between the reinsurer and
policy holder.
Yeah, the policy holder. That's just. And so ultimately, if there is a misunderstanding or what coverage is, arbitration is certainly a means to do that. It's really hard to say. Some reinsurers, you look at the ice storm, for example. The ice storm, if one would interpret the way policies were, the way reinsurance treaties were written up until the ice storm, it was not necessitated that all of the $1.4 billion of losses should have been reinsured. You had certain reinsurers that made the decision that they would pay for claims that technically weren't listed in their treaty wording, and that was perhaps a basis of goodwill. That goodwill had an influence on other reinsurers in the market where they all decided that they had to do this. But that's, in those types of circumstances, that's sort of what takes place. But no, there's no cut-through. Cut-through is the first rule of reinsurance, not to have that.
And I think perhaps the story coming out of the three illustrations so far and the three more that you're coming to here is we're getting a little more forceful that way. If you really want to cover supply chain, you better write the names down and you better put
I'll get into that. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's an evolving sort of science, you know what I mean? That I don't want to say this, but the insurance industry is just always so reactive. It's so hard to be proactive, and it's just, I don't know, it's kind of the way the industry is. It's like, people are saying, why didn't you think of those planes hitting the World Trade Center? Why didn't you think of the fuel of two planes going down the elevator? So this is, it's a reinforced, fire-resistant building, you know what I mean, one of the greatest ones. And why didn't you think that the fuel, that they'd go on the top, the fuel would go down the elevator shafts and create a candle effect and the whole thing would come down? I don't know. I guess people aren't proactive enough. It's just, you know what I mean? It's always the same way, being reactive versus proactive. I don't know. Yep.
The industry's not set up to be reactive, it's set up to be actuarial and deductive. So, it's that famous line, the past is the key to the future. So if you have nothing but a set of tables, and you're rating on tables, if something hits you that you didn't rate on before, well, not really, I don't see the industry really having the ability to be proactive in many ways.
And, and the cycle, too, the whole concept of, I say this a lot, and it makes me, I'm a bit of a skeptic sometimes, but, we have a cycle, depending on the line of business, we have a cycle that can range from 3 to 7 years, depending on the line of business, in terms of how the cycle goes, the pricing cycle, and, perhaps being quarterly focused, thinking of quarterly results versus the cycle, that also adds another kind of, the dynamic is, let's just get the quarter, let's just, you know what I mean? Like, it's globalization, it's our shareholders. Our shareholders don't just own insurance companies that deal with the cycle, they deal with manufacturers or financial services. And so I think the problem also is that since we're always worrying about this quarter and not thinking of the cycle and how it goes, it kind of contravenes how the business is set up. These are all these sort of external forces that affect things in some ways. So I've tried to talk about some of the Pathcats. It's not definitive, unfortunately, that some specific CBI loss or supply chain losses. But I think what's good for instance, if you've got some risk managers out there or you've got some insurers in terms of underwriting, I think what really comes down is to talk about the whats and the wheres. So it's important when looking at all of the supply chain loss that have taken place. A big part is what. So the concept is the more sophisticated the material, part, product being supplied, and the exclusivity of that part, product, or material, it makes it really much more difficult to supply. So the what. The where is even more important, and this is really we've been talking a lot about wheres today. Where things take place along the coast, or perhaps in Asia, places like that. So the wheres is if you have materials, parts, or products being produced in, let's say, the developing economies, normally it's low-cost, mass-produced components, such as China, or suppliers of raw materials, Africa. The developed economies, you've got suppliers of more high-end, low-volume components, Germany, or suppliers of raw materials also in Canada, so it's a bit of dynamic. I think wheres are really important, based on the research I've done over the years in terms of this. Like, the what, we can understand why something costs more to replace if there's going to be a bottleneck in terms of producing things like iPad 2s. But the wheres is a really big thing, I think. And I think wheres can be broken down into 4 areas. Underwriting, in terms of where to expect supply chain interruption. Well, if you look at an underwriting perspective, underwriting supply chain in regards to the global nat exposures, here's an example of Swiss Re. Now, I give Swiss Re, I worked there before. Munich Re has a very similar approach to this. I would think a lot of the larger reinsurers also have this. Ultimately, Swiss Re, what they do is they have a team of geoscientists, and they break down the world into about 119 zones. So they have like 40 zones. So you're looking at Australia, for example. Australia, they see there's 5 accumulation zones, 5 Nat Cat earthquake zones in Australia alone. They see there's 4 tropical cyclone zones alone. They see there's 1 flood. So what that means is that they control their exposures. They look at their exposures. They would look at supply chain as well based on those zones. Looking at Canada, for example, we see there's 3 earthquake zones that's what we would look at, and 1 convective storm. This is specifically for Swiss Re. So this is the first approach. Ultimately, if we want to think of where we can expect supply chain interruptions due to Nat Cat take place, we have to build up a system to control this. We have to do this based on ultimately R&D and ultimately to try and to make sure that the companies or that we do not have too much dependency or too much insurance exposure in those areas. The second one I call is climatic predisposition. Ultimately, when you're looking at tropical cyclones, Tropical cyclones take place So they always take place, the most of them take place between latitudes of 30 degrees north and 5 degrees north of the equator. So ultimately, tropical cyclones take place, so not between 5 degrees latitude, so let's say 10 degrees ultimately between the two, but up to 30 degrees both north and south, that's where the majority of tropical cyclones take place. So if you're trying to think of supply chain, and you're worried that perhaps that you're going to have too much exposure, or you're going to have interruption in terms of your product, and if your manufacturing is taking place in this yellow zone, then there is a higher chance that you're going to have tropical cyclone affect that factory and those exposures. The third thing is looking at climatic change. Another thing to look at in terms of the wheres is, okay, where have things changed? This is an example of, sea level, where sea levels have been rising. This is going up to 2008. What are we seeing here is that we're seeing ultimately a disproportionate increase in rising sea levels in Australasia. So, you look at this, say, well, is my supply chain based in those areas? Am I getting things? And then the last aspect in terms of the wheres has to do with socioeconomic issues. You know what I mean? Am I getting my supply, or are my customers located, let's say, but more supply I'm thinking here, is there a rapidly growing population? Is the infrastructure, is it already overburdened at the best of times? So, this is Kofi Annan. He had sort of brought up the aspect that ultimately this sort of confirms that we're seeing an upward trend that's caused by human activities. So this is ultimately socioeconomic issues is a big aspect in terms of it. So let's try and think. Yep.
Quick question: where would you put political disruption in that?
Socioeconomic. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Yeah, specifically, not political disruption, but
something like war.
Guess what I'm going to talk about? China. Okay, so let's use a case study based on those four things I just talked about. You know what I mean? And let's talk about China. So, based on this underwriting, based on Swiss Re, an underwriting perspective, they have 2 earthquake zones, 1 tropical cyclone zone, and 1 flood zone. So they're exposed to NatCat. Okay. They're located between 30 north and the equator and 5 degrees above the equator latitude. They're being affected by rising sea levels and socioeconomic changes. Rapidly growing population, infrastructure is not keeping up, political. This is a country that is not a true democracy, according to our perception of that country, and ultimately this is a country when a natural catastrophe or anything of a grand scale takes place that can affect a large portion of the population, you have a controlled environment, which doesn't always mean that things are going to work out properly in terms of how it's going to affect your supply chain. Ultimately, the perception is that the government doesn't want to change, irrespective of what takes place. But ultimately, China is an area that is ultimately very exposed. Here's China right here. This is ultimately a breakdown of China based on per capita gross domestic product. The darker areas have the highest GDP per capita. So let's look at the highest GDP provinces in terms of China. So we have Guangdong by the Pearl River. So Guangdong is it has the highest GDP in all of China. We have Jiangsu, number 2. We have Shandong, number 3. We have Zhejiang, number 4, and we have Hainan province, number 5. So what's happened here? Well, we had the Tangshan earthquake, considered the earthquake of the 20th century. Officially, according to when Mao was in power, Mao was still there, officially 267,000 people died. Unofficially, just 670,000 people died. So that was a 7.8, and appreciate that time, okay, this is right beside Shandong, it's in the province beside it, but appreciate that China in 1976, they didn't make anything for us. There was nothing there. So you had almost 700,000 people die, right? Construction, I don't know, in terms of construction, I don't think there'd be a lot of high-rise there. It was principally agricultural base, but appreciate that if this same earthquake takes place today, it's going to be massive. But that's not even the biggest they've had. How about in 1668? They had an 8.5 magnitude event take place, specifically in Shandong province. What about tropical cyclone? Well, hey, everybody's affected. All the most exposed areas of GDP this is the most exposed area to tropical cyclone in all of China. But that's not just that. What you also have to think about is Taiwan. Taiwan is 180, this is 180 kilometers. Taiwan is 180 kilometers off the coast here, from some of the most exposed area in all of China. So by bringing all this up, say is, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of supply chain. We just need a small earthquake, we need a tropical cyclone to take place, and we're not going to get our iPads, we're not going to get anything because of the dependency in terms of China.
I was going to mention, I was going to ask about Taiwan, because there was an earthquake not
1999?
Yeah, and there's a lot of semiconductor impact there.
You're right. I think it was a $12 billion loss or something like that, ultimately.
Was it 99, was it?
Could be. Yeah. Turkey was 90.
Pictures here on
Yeah.
one of our sessions.
Turkey was 99. I think Taiwan was 98. I'm trying to remember now.
Yeah, we sent an ICLR team down there to come back and tell us about it, and the part I remember was the east side of Taiwan is incredibly vulnerable to earthquakes, and the west side of Taiwan is more vulnerable than that. It was just not a good travel brochure about west Taiwan.
So is it, sorry, I missed part of it, I was on a conference all the way. So is it a paradigm shift, I mean, from a Canadian perspective, like I'm just thinking from an underwriting perspective, that underwriters are not thinking that on a global perspective,
No.
especially if you're looking at a manufacturing account, right?
No, but things are changing. I'm going to get into it in terms of how there has been a shift in terms of underwriting. I think actually I think it's a segue into other considerations. The evolution of CBI coverage. So ultimately, previously, it was not a very thought-out, focused underwriting process. You know, it was an evolution. Ultimately, CBI, this coverage of supply chain coverage, just came out as an extension of traditional BI. Not a lot of thought was put forward. We've seen this before. You know what I mean? Like, due to competitive pressure, it's a give me. We'll give it to you. We'll start off, we'll give you $5 million. You know, let's say, okay, I got an insured. They have $300 million of something. They have 150 of physical damage. Let's say they have $150 million of BI. You know what I'll do? I'll give you $5 million of CBI. But that was 10 years ago. Then the next year comes, okay, we'll give you 10. Then we'll give you 20. Before you know it, okay, they still have, let's say, $150 million of BI, but suddenly CBI just creeps up. It creeps, ultimately, it's limit creep is what it's called. You get limit creep, where suddenly CBI is up to $75 million. It's 50% of your BI limits, you know what I mean?
You have no idea what you're
And you have no idea. You have no idea at all. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You know, and you have endorsements that are vague. They're just sort of saying, okay, any supplier of goods. They actually, some endorsements said, any supplier of goods or services. They didn't say nothing else, just the way it was. And maybe that was okay when it was $5 million of 150, but not when it's perhaps half of the overall BI limit.
Are they writing the endorsements in the back of napkins yet?
Yeah, exactly.
Stop that.
And then there's been there has been a shift getting into second tier suppliers, you know what I mean? And even the concept, maybe you don't even need physical damage, but I've heard that, I haven't seen a lot of it. But that was previously, you know, and this is the real evolution I've seen since I've been sort of presenting this topic, is that things have really changed, and Sandy has really changed things. You know, ultimately, underwriters are really much more conscientious of the exposures, accumulations, global supply. CBI questionnaires are very thorough now. You know, applications have been revamped. And we're talking about global insurers. These are global insurers that are writing these coverages. Munich Re came out very clearly after Thailand and said that cat-exposed CBI policies need to be overhauled. You're seeing, so coverage limits are becoming more definitive, and you're seeing limits ultimately come down. You're seeing much greater onus. You're seeing absolute onus on insurers to identify their suppliers' customer exposures, and also they have to have detailed business continuity plans. That's a given now. You see insurers ultimately hiring catastrophe engineers. They're also doing business. They're actually hiring business continuity specialists. It is a much more proactive approach. It's still reactive, but it's perhaps a lot more scrutiny is taking place. What's interesting also is, while previously you might have any suppliers or customers, you're really seeing also a differentiation in terms of perils. You're seeing perhaps full coverage for first-tier suppliers and customers, which are listed in the policy. You know what I mean? They're listed in the policy. They're broken down in terms of the supply chain of that specific insured. You're seeing limited perils for you're seeing non-earthquake, non-flood for second tiers. That's getting away the whole Thailand, perhaps the Thailand effect. Also, you're seeing things like civil authority, ingress, egress, service interruption. Those things are also being much more carefully underwritten. So that's the first, in terms of the evolution. You're seeing a much more savvy approach to underwriting. Another aspect is the modeling of the exposures. One thing has to be clear, ultimately appreciate that the area that I work in is principally NatCat modeling, most of the time in terms of treaty exposures. But people have to appreciate that CBI, we are nowhere near being able to model from a NatCat perspective CBI exposures, okay? None of the models, RMS, Area QE, none of them can do this. And none of the reinsurers can do it either. And why is that? And that's because NatCat models, in terms of BI is connected to physical damage at the specific geocoded location. So you come to me, you say, Paul, I want you to model this exposure. I want you to tell me how much the building is going to be damaged and how much the BI is going to be damaged. I say, sure, provide me your information. I want to know exactly where it's located. I want to know how many stories. I want to know the construction. I want to know the year of construction, and so on and so on. The thing is, when I put that in my model, my third-party model, or a treaty, a reinsurer like Swiss Re or Munich Re does it, they're specifically modeling exposure at that location. You know what I mean? That's based on those attributes, those specific attributes. If you get into the CBI realm and you're like, well, I've got a supplier, like I'm located in Vancouver, fine, and this is where I am, but I also have a supplier in Colorado and I have a supplier in Japan. Well, we're going to need that information. Appreciate that it is already the realm of modeling NatCat exposures is already, you could be looking at maybe, 30 to 40 pieces of information specifically in your location. Are you willing to provide that information for your suppliers? Or how about the suppliers of your suppliers? This is the thing. CBI, I don't think we're anywhere close to being able to model something like that. But pricing it is still going on. For example, PwC, only in March, I think March of this year, they've come out and they're trying to do is they've set up a global project to try and price they're looking at multi-tier supply chain loss. And they've ultimately got a global project where they're trying to be able to price this. Now, this is pricing on an individual basis. This isn't doing it on a NatCat model like what I'm talking about. They're trying to do expected loss costs of something like this on an individual basis. And what's interesting is this is a quote that was put out and say that their CBI pricing models in its beginning stages. And this is what I think is funny, is they say, we liken it to the state of NatCat modeling following Hurricane Andrew. Andrew was 1992. There's still mistakes. It's still a black box in so many ways, okay? Andrew was 92. How many years later is it? You know what I mean? We're 21 years later, okay? So does that mean that PwC in 21 years, they're going to have a better idea about it? Modeling supply chain exposures is going to take a long time. Finally, in terms of the last consideration is in terms of government regulatory involvement in the supply chain. The White House in 2012 came out with the National Strategy for the Global Supply Chain Security. This is President Obama who came out with this actually, so this is proposed proposed by him himself. And the two main goals were to promote the efficient, secure movement of goods and foster resilient supply chain. So the U.S. federal government is thinking of supply chain. It's something that only came out in 2012. What's been done so far? Not very much. Ultimately, what you're trying to appreciate is in America, you have so much private enterprise that's involved in infrastructure. You're trying to bring government and infrastructure together to work together to be able to handle large catastrophes that take place. But some of the ideas they're talking about is enhanced security of the infrastructure. So this is also like security, meaning the infrastructure itself, but security in terms of terrorism is involved in this as well. Other ideas are maximize the flow of legitimate trade. Again, there's some dual purposes here. Make sure there's no illegal trade. It's not just supply chain, it's to stop bad supply chain. Mitigate systematic vulnerability, which is very important. They even use the word think globally. They realize America is very dependent in terms of the global supply chain. It's an essential aspect. And understand and address vulnerabilities. So that's one aspect of government and regulatory involvement in the supply chain. The second one is very close to my heart and something that I've been dealing with, and that has to do with the revised B9 Earthquake Exposure Sound Practice Guideline. I don't know if a lot of you know, but ultimately earthquake exposures, insurers and reinsurers are required to buy minimum amounts of earthquake coverage, which ultimately are guidelines that have been out since 1998. Well, just recently, ultimately I think it was released in February or March of 2013, there was a revision of this guideline. And previously it used to say, either use a model or use sort of like these deterministic, these percentages to determine what your earthquake exposure is, and you have to buy that minimum amount. And it was on a, I don't want to get too technical, but it went from a 250-year return period in 1998 to 500 years in 2022. So it's trying to get the insurance industry to be more conservative in how much earthquake exposure they can ultimately buy reinsurance to, so they can handle it. So there's no impact on the overall economy. So that was the original. The revision in 2013 is much more detailed, and that specific revision is saying things like PML, it says this in the guidelines, it says PML estimates should properly reflect non-model exposures. I've just told you that CBI is not modeled. It's impossible to model it currently in terms of the model. They say that these non-model exposures may include contingent business interruption. So now the federal government, or the OSFI, is coming out and they're saying, you have to think about CBI, supply chain, when you buy your earthquake exposures. So the thing is, these are great ideas. How are we going to do it? It's impossible to model CBI. Well, impossible, I'm being, but ultimately, what we have in terms of these guidelines is, we have and this is just specifically in regards to supply chain. There's all kinds of things in these new guidelines. They also bring up the concept increased seismicity. They want insurance companies to think of like what happened in New Zealand. There's a September loss. Ultimately, it creates a geophysical change in terms of the vulnerability of the area from a seismic perspective, and then the earthquake takes place in Christchurch, which has much more loss. All because the preceding loss in the September made it a much more vulnerable area. The government ultimately has a wish list, a very broad wish list, which in realistic terms aren't very easy to ultimately apply. So, that's the end of the presentation. I'm open for any questions you guys have. So, shoot away if you have any. Yep.
One of the things I read in the paper this morning was bridge on I-5 between Portland and Vancouver fell off. It fell in the river.
Sure.
And the first thing I thought of was, it's a major highway, big network, goes right to the border. So probably not as big as I thought this morning because of the terms of the contract. There's no factories impacted. It's a bridge that fell off a major highway.
Yeah. And you don't know if it's a toll bridge or not. The Langley Bridge you're charged, right? And that had a big loss. They had a massive concrete block before the Langley Bridge.
This is a truck hit a bridge.
A truck hit a bridge.
The truck hit the bridge. A piece of the bridge fell into the river, and the whole I-5 is shut down.
Well, what's the first thing you think of? Okay, how much liability limits does that trucker have, right? Never the loss. But he's probably going to have, well, he's a trucker. He's probably going to have $5 million limit.
Yeah.
No, there's that. Yeah, you cannot, like,
I can't use the bridge anymore.
well, there's other ways of, that's not the only bridge for you to use, guys. That's not going to be.
It won't be a big investment.
I find it interesting, you said, I do business continuity consulting and planning, and I find it interesting you say that there's an upswing in this because of supply chain. I've seen this at senior levels, like very large companies will do this, and also will do business continuity planning because of this, and also banks, if they're forced by regulations and so on, companies will do this. But at the mid-range companies and smaller companies are not doing business continuity in some cases at all, let alone taking a look at supply chain. So I find it interesting, there is an upswing to some extent, but I would say there's a huge vulnerability out there as well, because a lot of them aren't doing it. And when you actually get in and start doing it for them, you find a lot of the risk assessments out there that are being done and there's no other way of putting it, they're poor.
Yeah.
They're lucky if they get beyond low, medium, and high, and it's a perceptual concept, and they quite often won't even bring in any hazard calculations. So I'm not sure that in the long run, or at least now, the bulk of business out there sort of gets it. I think that maybe some of the large ends, larger companies, they're starting to, but mid-size and below, not at all.
So you're talking in terms of the clients you deal with, these are companies that are dependent with outsourcing overseas, things like that? These are
some of them are dependent with outsourcing, but it's not even just risks like that. Some of them don't even understand the risk that their hard drive systems might fail, or that you walk into their IT rooms and they're sitting in the basement under the sewer pipes and they're in an earthquake zone. So they haven't even got beyond this sort of risk assessment, let alone starting to talk about the risk assessments of their suppliers.
But I guess in terms of when I say uptake, again, I'm strictly talking about the United States because that's where most of the information
That may be, yeah.
And also America is one of the leading economies in the world.
Also, I find there's a lot of talk. Like, there's a lot of PowerPoint presentations.
The statistics I've seen, the stats I've seen is that this is based on a primary broker in the United States. They said that they think 75% of all supply chain needs are currently being provided. And this is based on scale. These are small insureds. This is based in terms of their planning, in terms of what they have. Yet 25% is outstanding. And those 25% outstanding has to do with very, large scale, like outsourcing all over the place, which ultimately they're customized solutions. So.
Also, I talk to a lot of underwriters, and one of the questions, it's a big thing in the business continuity industry because everyone says, you should have a business continuity plan. Well, you go to the insurer and say, is the insurer going to give them a discount for having a business continuity plan? And inevitably the answer is no. And then usually you'll get a small qualifier, but many of these clients, we won't even give them a policy if they don't have a business continuity plan.
I think it all depends on limit too, right? It's all a relationship of what limit are they seeking, what is the relationship?
All I'm saying is just, I'm not seeing it, and when I directly ask.
What you saying, I guess the big thing.
I'm not talking in terms of insured limits, I'm talking just to an underwriter. Do you require a business continuity plan before you will give
I would think,
policy?
I don't know, maybe Don, you'd think the same way as being, I've been underwriter for 20 years. If I'm going to give you $5 million and that's $5 million of $100 million, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I probably won't care about a business continuity plan, right? I think I think there's a big aspect in terms of that. So that's why
That's why you asked the question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, but if you want the same CBI limit as your BI limit, and I'm not asking for it, then I'm an idiot.
And I'd agree with that, but as I said, when I ask these questions, I don't necessarily get the answer from the underwriter. They go either A, we don't ask for it, or B, the answer you say, if it's a large enough limit, yeah, we do ask for it, and then the conversation dies, and I'm not 100% sure that, I've gotten the full answer. And interesting, that 75% fulfillment thing, actually, I take it back. The missing 25% is either complex risk, this is actually based on Willis, it was Willis Research, Willis, the primary broker in the United States. They said the outstanding 25% supply chain coverage is because of perhaps complex risks or also because of lacking business continuity plans, interestingly, so not sufficient enough information. Is it possible that they're more sophisticated in America versus us when it comes to things like this? I don't know. Maybe things are taking time too. Maybe, it's hard to say. There could be a delayed effect in terms of how things are being rolled out here as well. You know what I mean? I'd be curious to know if you dealt with a Canadian-based company versus, let's say, a global company. Mainly Canadian-based companies, but my associates have dealt with global companies and.
Yeah, because I know that mainly globals must make up easily 80 to 90% of the supply chain.
But even then, you are lucky if your business continuity information makes it over to the risk management group. You find huge amounts of siloing in all of these organizations.
I would say, just from our perspective with Canadian industrial risks, that where CBI is an issue and it's being asked for, and we say they want policy limits equal to the BI type of thing, and then so the client wants something and the broker's coming to us and so we're being asked to evaluate it. First of all, if the broker has done an evaluation, it's very simplistic, and if you have questions, you go back to the insured, say through the broker or whatever. They don't really know, to be honest. You scratch the surface and the ignorance it doesn't take long to get to dig too deep. That they don't understand it and very much either.
But CBI, I talked about these recent examples just because they'll also be more vivid in your mind, but CBI has been an issue, and I was at Munich Re back then, but it was the Nokia loss. There was a massive Nokia loss where, CBI, it got into our checklist, it got into our regime. When I was at Munich Re back, it was a massive Nokia loss. Actually, that's a Taiwan earthquake. It was a Taiwan earthquake. It was the microchips that couldn't be produced. I don't know if it was 98.
99.
99 was Turkey.
99.
Both of them were Turkey.
I think it was both 99, yeah.
They were both 99. But I think it was about a $600 or $700 million loss that happened to Nokia because they couldn't get a specific microchip because of the Taiwan earthquake.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, I don't know maybe the higher you go in terms of global exposures, maybe there's been more.
I would suspect that there's
more
sophistication there, but I'm saying at that mid-level, and even some of the larger ones, when you ask the questions, quite often there's no there. And I'm always very big on saying, well, we put all this work in this business continuity plan. Go take it to your risk manager. Bring your risk managers in. Make sure this goes out in your next insurance quote. Well, you can only tell too much to say so much to your client before you become a bit bit of a pest, but, you know, you always try, but you're not sure that it's happening, and quite often I'm pretty sure it's not.
Sounds like we need to shop it around a bit too. There is some competition in this realm, certainly. You know what I mean? You're not dealing with the right insurers in some ways. There should be something there.
Preaching to the choir.
Yeah, I know.
I fully agree.
But the rates aren't low enough? Jesus.
Yeah, but they're not really, so.
Well, you started your presentation by talking about the last.
Amen.
Yeah, I think it was a really powerful part of what we shared with us.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, one of the other things I think that shifts over the last 20 years, I think the large buyers, the large manufacturers, service providers, whatever, the large buyers of insurance are a little more sophisticated in understanding and where they feel insurance helps them manage their risk and where they feel it's not I don't know if British Petroleum is very sophisticated, but they chose not to insure what ended up being a horrific spill that they had in Mexico. So there are some large buyers that are choosing in some aspects where insurance is available, but they don't choose to buy it because they don't like the price or they think that their corporate structure is enough, they'll keep it all internally, whatever. Your sense as contingent business industry evolves over the next 10 or 20 years, do you think there'll be a number of large companies that are going to actually do some of the internal analysis and think about how they're managing this, but not necessarily reach out to the insurance industry?
Self-insured themselves, captives, that's a possibility. It all depends on the competitive nature of the marketplace, I guess. I understand that I don't want to get into certain, I can think of two, one Swiss-based writer and one U.S.-based writer, California-based writer that are massive writers in terms of supply chain. So I think that there's a New York-based company, John Street. I can think of three big writers that are large writers of this, so there seems to be some kind of a competitive realm. So I guess it all depends in terms of scarcity of capacity. Right. And price. I mean, if the price that's what I mean. Capacity is what applies to price at the end of the day, right? So, that could be a possibility, I guess. The Apples, the large multinationals, those types of things. Ford, for example, Ford has been severely, not in a bad way, they didn't really incur any losses, but they've been very open, their risk manager's been very open in terms of how much their insurance has gone up, their CBI coverage has gone up, they're paying for it, but Ford is the best example of having a business continuity plan that ultimately is being respected by their insurers, and they're working with the insurance industry to do that, so Ford is probably the most prominent in terms of a good Samaritan, it's not, a good corporate citizen,
Good
right?
example.
But there could be the day, right? Like the China thing, if something happens in China, who knows? It could just disrupt all the capacity in the marketplace. So
Walmart's a bit closed.
Well, Walmart is a good example of Hurricane Katrina, right? Walmart was the only company that was able to survive Hurricane Katrina and stay open in the parking lots like they did. Their logistics was perfect. Walmart was the most successful company in terms of Hurricane Katrina. They dealt with
and Walmart goes beyond it. It's not just their own internal programs, but they have what would be known as a disaster and emergency management program. They will go out of their way to help others. Like they will be providing free things to
the parking lots.
Yeah, not just selling, keeping them.
Oh no, community.
Home Depot as well.
And Loblaws.
So I think a common thread running through Japan, Thailand, and Sandy was none of the three were modeled. I believe they're not model losses, and two of the three were not peak losses. So I understand.
Sandy in Thailand, I guess. Well, actually, right.
Well, Japan wasn't.
Model miss. It was.
We said it was a 9. Nobody expected non-model loss. So can we talk about modeling CGI when we haven't even modeled some of these secondary? Like that would be called a secondary loss, not a peak event, but a secondary event. So I mean, how do we fill that gap?
I don't know. I brought that up when I was talking about model. Right now, priorities in modeling are not CBI. The priorities in modeling right now are Japan tsunami. Japan tsunami is the number one thing. The second thing is liquefaction. So it's all about recent events. So Japan tsunami is the most important peril to model right now for the third-party modelers as well as for the private companies like Munich Re and Swiss Re. The second most important thing is liquefaction. Ultimately, Christchurch liquefaction that took place, it was completely underestimated. Those are the two top priorities on a global basis for CAT modeling. CBI, maybe it's third, but something might happen tomorrow where it's a heck of a lot more important. You know what I mean?
Is there a
Because
list of,
it's so intangible. It's just so like, you know.
we have a very short list of peak losses, California earthquake, Tokyo earthquake, Japanese typhoon, a European winter storm, and then it trails off very quickly. Is there a long list of secondary non-peak losses that we have to model and somebody's ticking off the lists?
Yeah, it could be Johannesburg earthquake. It could be Sydney earthquake. BC is a secondary scenario, right? The Cascadia, including the Pacific Northwest. But yeah, it's all about money. All about money and R&D. Wherever there's loss, wherever people have to pay money, that's where they do the R&D. That's what will always drive the way it works. It'll never change. I don't, that's reality. That's
Closing the barn door after.
Anything else? No? Well, thank you very much.
Everybody can join me in thanking Paul for his